Thank you very much, Michelle. And thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you all today. The first thing I noticed when I arrived is this. And I'm not quite sure what sort of seminar I'm supposed to give with a football, but I'm going to put that back. If anybody falls asleep, I will lob it into the audience. So what I'd like to do today is try and put together some kind of summaries to some fairly broad questions. So pollinators has recently shot up the agendas kind of scientifically, I think the policy agendas and also the public agendas. But the work on pollinators and pollination services has been sort of like trickling along in the background for quite a long time, but there's been a kind of big resurgence in the last sort of few years. So what I'm going to do is just give a little bit of background about how are our pollinators doing? What's the current kind of status and trends of pollinators in the UK? And I've got 6 kind of quite broad questions that I'm going to try and answer, at least in part. I'm not going to be able to answer them completely. And just try and take you through a journey about how pollinators link to food security, what are the things driving the delivery of services, and what can we do to get the best out of our pollinator communities. So we'll start with a little bit of background, just some kind of, key facts that people may know already. So around the world, about 3/4 of all our crops, our food crops, depend at least in part on pollinators for their productivity. And that's both in generating kind of high calorific food, but also many of the crops that pollinators visit are packed full of micronutrients, so many of our fruits and vegetables. So the food from pollinators or pollination services has a really important impact on kind of human diets because it's full of these vitamins and minerals. Similarly, most of the wildflowers around the world also depend on insect pollination, so it's highest in the tropics, but it drops down a little bit in temperate areas, but still it's more than 3/4 of all our wildflowering plants. And in terms of the actual values, so these are the values of pollination services just to agriculture. So an estimate made in 2005 came up with about £122 billion per annum, so it's quite a big chunk of value there. And in the UK, the last estimate we managed to make in 2011 was about £691 million to UK agriculture. And I'll unpack and I'll explain a little bit how we come to this figure, and I'll also explain why it is a very conservative figure, very low compared to actually some of the other hidden values. And these hidden values you could call kind of non-market values, and I'll explain a little bit about those in a minute. So that's our background. So what's the kind of context? How are our pollinators doing? So first of all, let's take managed honeybees, the most widespread of all managed pollinators around the world. And we did a piece of work back in 2005 to try and actually for the first time quantify the kind of the shifts or the current status of honeybees. And what we did, we collected a bunch of national statistics, and we just asked the question, what's the difference in the number of hives between 1985 and the current time, which was 2005? And we can see there's a few places, there's been some increases in the number of hives over that period, but the consistent picture across the whole of Central Europe and most of Northern Europe was kind of quite severe declines. Particularly in England, 54% loss over that period, 23% in Wales, and slightly less in Scotland. Concurrent with that, a loss of beekeeping numbers. And I think it's important just to show that, this study was carried out in 2005 when this data wasn't known. There was a big question about how honeybees are doing. We do have a recent resurgence in beekeeping in the UK. We have a few more hives. But the key message here is we've lost so many. We've lost about half of our hives between 85 and 2005. And we've got a slight increase in the last few years, but it's nowhere near taking us back to where we were. So we're still quite depauperate in terms of the number of hives we have in the UK. Then the wild counterparts of honeybees. So in the UK, we have about 250 species of what we call solitary bees. And back in 2006, we pulled together some huge data sets from the National Biodiversity Network, about 500,000 records. And we asked the question, how has the diversity of solitary bees changed before and after 1980? So each one of these squares here is a 10 by 10 kilometre grid where we had enough data to do a rigorous analysis. And the warm colours, the reds and the oranges, indicate there's been a loss, yellows neutral, blues slight increase. But the key message here is in more than half of the landscapes where we had data, there was a significant loss in diversity of solitary bees before and after 1980. And Of our 250 species of bees, 71 are on a red list. Now, a red list is basically flagging up that those species are of conservation concern. So this is things like Natural England and Wildlife Trust recognising that these particular species are under threat. So it just kind of shows that there's been loss in diversity and some of them are rare and declining. Also very good data showing fairly consistent losses of butterflies, both in diversity and abundance around the UK. I've included butterflies here as a pollinator, but in the UK it's a bit of a misnomer. They're not really pollinators. In the tropics they're fantastic, contribute to crop pollination. A few wildflowers in the UK, but it's a bit of a misnomer to call butterflies pollinators, but it's well embedded in the literature, so I'll just run with butterflies being part of the pollinating fauna. And we also analysed, shifts in hoverflies, and we found that were some winners, some were doing better, some were doing worse, and some were kind of more or less the same. So an overall kind of picture of generally loss, especially of bees and butterflies, but maybe some mixed patterns for hoverflies. So some problems there. 2006, that's nearly a decade ago, so we redid the analysis quite recently. Possibly some better news on the horizon. So this time we took 14 million records of bees, of butterflies, of wild plants, and we conducted quite a complex rarefaction analysis, some quite sophisticated statistics. And these are the outputs for 3 countries, for Holland, for Belgium and the UK. We did it by time slices from the Second World War up to date. We did it at multiple spatial scales. Very, very complicated. But the message that came out from this was that actually the declines that we had previously noted were actually slowing, which is probably a good thing. And even for a few species, actually even reversing. So maybe some good news there. Possibly things like agri-environment schemes or better protected areas in the UK are helping some of our pollinators. But there's a big caveat that goes with this. The bee and butterfly communities are becoming very similar, becoming more homogeneous. So back in the 1980s, the bee communities, say here in East Malling, would have been much more distinct to the ones in Reading or Bristol or Edinburgh than they are now. These communities are becoming very similar, very homogeneous across the UK. And the reason being is the declines have slowed because many of the most sensitive species we've lost, they've gone. So actually what we're ending up with are communities dominated by quite generalist, quite common species. So things are starting to look the same. So policy-wise, there was kind of a bit of a cheer. It's like, great, we're not losing pollinators as quick as we were. But actually on the ecological side, and I'm going to show a little bit later on the kind of pollination and production side, it's a bit worrying because we've lost a lot of the key diversity that helps provide stability to our pollination systems. So I think we can be a little bit happy that things are slowly reversing, but we haven't fixed the problem. I think that's the key message there. Okay, so there's been these losses in honeybees, there's been these losses in the whole series of wild pollinators. What's actually pushing that? What's causing that? Now, I'm not going to go into detail in all of these. I'm going to pick one, which is going to be land use change, which I'm going to explore a bit more. But just to give you a quick tour around. So we know that things like habitat loss, or the breaking up of habitats into small pieces, fragmentation, or the loss of quality of habitats, so degradation, all have impacts on pollinators, quite negative ones. And there's lots of independent studies showing that this is the case. I'll come back to explore a couple of those in a minute. We also know that pathogens can be important. So these are things like diseases and pests, particularly for honeybees, it's well reported. But as we look more and more to kind of wild pollinators, we're finding actually they have quite heavy loads of pathogens as well. Then we've got agrochemicals. I mean, the debate on pesticides at the moment is very intense, many, many open questions, and good evidence of direct impacts of insecticides on pollinators, but also sublethal effects as well. But when I talk about agrochemicals, I also want to make sure that we include in there things like herbicides. So high use of herbicides is basically reducing the diversity and availability of arable weeds in farmlands, and that's obviously going to have a knock-on effect on many flower-visiting pollinators as well. The big driver, the juggernaut of climate change. So many of our declining species, we found good correlational evidence suggesting that climate change is one of the main drivers causing their losses in the UK and globally. But there's also some more subtle effects. So it's not just things moving through the landscape being driven by climate change, maybe not having new habitats to visit, but changes in the phenology. So we know that many of the kind of UK bees are emerging very, very early. They're starting to emerge asynchronously from some of their forage plants. So you've got other effects of climate change as well, both kind of spatial pressures, but also temporal pressures as well. And finally, invasive plants. So, you know, in our UK agroecosystems, we've got many invasive plants, and some of these draw pollinators away from native plants. So those native plants are losing their pollinators. And the knock-on effect is we're changing some of our plant communities, and that's having a follow-on effect to change some of our pollinator communities. So that's kind of the five, if you want, broad families of stressors on pollinators. There's some more, well, I'll let you make your mind up of how serious contenders they are for real drivers. Well reported in the media. An absolute favourite, power lines. No evidence. Another favourite, mobile phones. I spend so much time trying to reply to people who've got genuine inquiries about it. There is no evidence. There's not a single validated, statistically correct study to ever show that cell phones have ever had an impact on pollinators. But it is a favourite. It keeps popping up in the media. And my current favourite at the moment, alien abduction. It would be a really nice experiment to test to see if that's the real cause. Well, I can't see anybody funny, but again, no evidence. But a lot of chat about it. What we do know is actually it's the combinations of some of these drivers that are really the kind of the lethal cocktails that are causing the declines. So give an example. So a pesticide at a low level on its own may not have a severe effect on the pollinator population. A pathogen on its own may not either. But if you were to weaken the immune system of a honeybee or a bumblebee with pesticides, that might make it much more susceptible to a pathogen, and then that gives you a kind of a lethal effect. And the same with climate change and habitat loss. Each of those on their own at a kind of modest, moderate level may not have a big impact on pollinators, but if you lose habitats and then climate change is pushing you through the landscape and you haven't got those habitats to go to, then you can get this kind of lethal combination. And we're just starting to sort of unpick these interactions. It's really complicated. And there's not only two-way interactions, there's probably three-way or even four-way. So it's a big challenge to understand what's really driving. So I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to just talk about one driver. I'm going to talk about habitat loss and habitat change, because we do know quite a lot about that. And we've got to the stage now where we can bring together lots of general evidence and come up with some kind of general kind of conclusions. So 6 kind of questions I'm going to kind of run through, give some what's the state of the art of our knowledge on these. So the first one is, you know, what values do pollinators provide society? I've kind of given you a bit of a taster about the economic ones. A really simple question, who actually pollinates? You would have thought we would have nailed that a long time ago, and actually it's quite recently we've bottomed this one out. Does current supply meet demand, and is that going to be enough for the future? That's a fairly fundamental question for growers. And how does the kind of the landscape context, or how does the wider landscape affect pollinator communities and pollination services? And then to focus in a little bit more, how does the way we manage our farms, you know, management practices, how does that impact on pollinators? So large scale and small scale. And then finally, how do we safeguard pollination services? So how do we get the best out of our pollinators for food security? What are the tools we can use to make sure that they're conserved and the services are well managed? So we start with that first question. We take our generic pollinators here. They contribute to agricultural production, crops and orchards and so on, and this value of 691 million for the UK. But it's an underestimate because it doesn't take into account those things that are grown in allotments and also those things that are grown in home gardens. And that's not a trivial contribution, actually. We've not done the maths for the UK, but in France it's not far off equivalent in value to what's actually going through agriculture. But then we've got some more indirect kind of benefits as well. So many of the forage crops that our dairy and livestock industry feed also depend on pollinators. So clover, for instance, white clover is a good example. Particularly in the States, things like alfalfa are very highly pollinator dependent. And of course, honeybees produce a whole set of hive products. The best known, of course, is honey. And the point I want to make here is that to the UK economy, honey's worth about 10 to 30 million pounds per year. Depends a lot on the weather and various things. but that's a whole order of magnitude less than the value of pollination services. So honey is important, but in terms of contribution to UK economy, pollination is a much bigger factor. And then we can also think about healthy pollinator communities are important for healthy plant communities. And these plant communities provide seeds, and they provide fruits, and they provide shelter and forage for a whole range of other wildlife. So pollinators are, part of these kind of ecological webs. They contribute to the stability of wider ecosystems. And also these plant communities, many plants which depend on pollinators, they also produce a whole suite of other ecosystem services. So we can talk about things like cultural services. So the Scottish thistle, greatly valued. Flowery parks, meadows in the countryside, our own back gardens, the kind of the colour and the richness depends a lot on pollinators. But also these plants are important for things like soil protection, so the cohesiveness of the soil, the fertility of the soil, even water quality is indirectly linked to pollinators. So I'm not saying pollinators are responsible for all of this, but they're part of an important kind of web that needs to be stable if we're going to achieve all of these things. So how do we get to this value for agriculture in the UK? Well, if we take individual crops, so let's take oilseed rape. We know from experiments that 25% of the production of oilseed depends on pollinators, the rest being self or wind pollinated. We know the farm gate price for oilseed production in the UK, so we can do a simple bit of maths and say, overall, it's about £277 million is what pollinators contribute to oilseed. And if we do it for all the other things, strawberries and apples, and also lots of other minor crops, and we tot up all these values here, then this is where we get this number from. I think what's quite interesting is that this value has been going up through time. So starting in 2007, when we first did this, we expect we're going to redo it again for 2014. We're going to be knocking on the door of almost £1 billion a year in terms of what the contribution to UK economy is. So it's not trivial. Each crop is different. Well, that's kind of obvious, but each crop is different in terms of how pollinator kind of communities provide the service to them. So just to give an example, so these are the kind of main groups of our pollinators: honeybees, bumblebees, solitary bees, hoverflies, and other insects, some small flies and whatever. We take field beans. Well, bumblebees pretty much do all the work. This is the visitation. These are legitimate flower visits, and it's the bumblebees that are primarily responsible for field beans. If we look at apple, we've got a much more kind of diverse set of contributions. So we've got honeybees, solitary bees, and other insects. Strawberries, well, honeybees seem to be the champions here with some help from bumblebees. And then oilseed rape is a real mixed bag. So lots of kind of other insects, these small flies, but also honeybees. So crops are very different in terms of the kind of the signature of pollinators that they use for pollination. And equally, each pollinator is different. So if we take the example of apples, what we've done, we've worked out the individual contributions to the overall productivity and the bottom line for farmers. So for a hectare of apples, we know that hoverflies contribute about £300 per hectare. It sounds like it's a useful contribution. But actually, honeybees do a much better job. They contribute £1,300. And then we get into the heavyweights. So bumblebees contributing more than £3,000 per hectare. And actually, at the end of the day, it's solitary bees. They're the real champions for your growers when it comes to apple. They're contributing £7,500 per hectare. So all of these are important, but some are more important than others. And to kind of really get to quantify the benefits we're getting from pollinators, again, I'm going to run with apples. I think that's very apt since I'm in East Malling today. It's both about yield and quality. So this axis here is about the fruit set at harvest, so that's post-thinning. And you can kind of do very simple experimental treatments to manipulate the level of pollination that's occurring. So you can put bags around your flowers, keep all your pollinators out, and you'll still get some production, but it's about 10% or a little bit less than 10% fruit set. As soon as you let pollinators in, you get an increase. And the difference between these two is, kind of the risk of getting it wrong. So if you get pollinators in there, you're going to get this amount, but for any reason you don't have pollinators, you're going to drop down to here. So that's a kind of a risk in terms of yield. We can do hand pollination, so that's where we are pollinators. We collect really high quality pollen, and we make sure that the apple is not lacking any quantity or quality of pollen. And you can take your kind of your yield all the way up to kind of 28, 29%. And this is your kind of, if you want your opportunity. So it's kind of suboptimal here just in open pollination. So there is a potential for growers to get more pollination and actually get their yield levels up here. Now, apple's peculiar in the sense that it needs thinning, so you don't want hugely heavy yields on trees. But this is all post-thinning. This is at harvest, so this is a real potential yield you can get. But actually what's more important than yield, I think, is the quality benefits you get from pollination. So up until quite recently, people were always thinking about tonnage or kind of number of apples or number of field beans or whatever number of seeds. But actually, it's the quality benefits that seem to be the most important. Now, for apples, we use number of seeds. That's a very good proxy because it's related to sugar content, to size, to shape, and other commercial grades. If you have no pollination at all, you get almost no seeds. As soon as you let things be open pollinated, you get a big kind of increase here. But the most benefit is when you have hand pollination. There's a huge opportunity here to increase the quality by getting your pollination right. So this is kind of open ambient, but you can actually hike it up to get actually much better kind of yield benefits as a grower. So if we start to kind of translate this data into actually the bottom line for the grower and actually think about different varieties of apple, there's really a huge number of varieties. If we take the situation for cocks, and this is actually the value per hectare, you can see with no pollinators it's about £8,000. Open pollination it's about £20,000. And actually for cocks, there's no benefits to getting the pollination better. It's pretty much as good as it can be. But varieties differ. So for Gala, you've got the same base level with almost no, where you exclude pollinators. When you let them in, it jumps up. But you've also got this kind of deficit here. So actually, there's a really nice opportunity for Gala growers to get better pollination in their orchards and actually realise increased production in terms of quality and also profit the bottom line. So I think that's a nice opportunity. And that is something like £6 million of untapped potential in UK apple economy. So maybe other varieties as well have similar opportunities, but this we definitely know is the one for Gala. So I hope I've convinced you there's some pretty good diverse sets of values there. I'd like to just try and answer a very basic question: which species are the most important for pollination? I've kind of given you a bit of a kind of idea so far, but surprisingly, there was this, what we'd call a widely held belief by many people that honeybees basically did all the pollination. I would say up until about 5 to 10 years ago, it was assumed by government and I think by a lot of researchers and a lot of growers that honeybees were pretty much did everything. We weren't so sure about that. It didn't kind of match up with our field data and our experiences. So we tried to look at the supply and demand of honeybees, and we looked at the actual availability of hives in the UK using national statistics. So the government, through the National Bee Unit, keeps very good data on the number of hives. We can calculate the demand based on what is the area of crops, and we know how many honeybee hives you should be putting in per hectare to get proper pollination. So you can create a kind of overall demand. So the big question is, does supply meet demand? So if we plot this out, this is a timeline here from early 1980s approaching to 2007, 2008. And this here is the proportion of pollination that can be done by honeybees. So we found back in 1984, there were enough honeybees, if we put them all in the right place, all at the right time in the season, we could get about a third of our crops pollinated. So by default, since we haven't got catastrophic losses of crops due to lack of pollination, means that somebody else is doing the work. Well, it's got to be the wild pollinators. There's nothing else out there. So honeybee is important in the 80s, but their importance has dropped. So the data most recently we have is from 2007, suggests that actually only about 15% of our UK crops are being pollinated or could be pollinated by honeybees. So somebody else is picking up the real majority of the work. So I'm not saying honeybees are not important. They're a really useful management tool, but we actually have had a bit of a shift in thinking about how do we manage and protect this service to make sure that food security isn't threatened. Because if you manage your honeybees really well, you still may only get 15%, maybe a bit more pollination. And one of the big challenges is the areas that need pollination, things like oilseed rape, are going up massively. So, the Renewable Fuels Directive is asking for more biofuel, so the areas of oilseed are going up. I think there's more soft and top fruit area going up. I mean, Michelle, you can correct me. I think it seems to be increasing. That's what industry is saying. So there's a greater demand, but if stocks are going down, we're kind of coming to a pinch point at some juncture. And then just to show you that we're not alone in this, this is the same kind of analysis applied to the whole of Europe. All you need to know here is if you're a green country, which are these ones in southeast Europe, you've got enough honeybees potentially. But through most of Europe, and particularly in places like the UK and Central Europe, we have a massive shortfall in the number of honeybees. So somebody else is doing all this work. And if we jump one stage higher, we go beyond Europe, we think about it globally. So we did something called a meta-analysis, where we took lots of data sets from crops all around the world, in fact 41 different studies, and we looked at the contributions made by honeybees and the contributions made by wild bees. And what we find when we do the analysis, these are all the different crops. You've got almond, coffee, pigeon pea, mango, all sorts of things along here. This is a very simple diagram. It looks a bit confusing. But basically, if something's having a positive effect or it's contributing to yield, it needs to be a point above this 0 line here. And it has to be significant when the error bars don't overlap with this 0 line here. So the simple message is, for all crops, these are the kind of purple dots, wild insects, or particularly wild bees, increase fruit set in all these global crops. However, in just 14% of cases, you get this strong positive correlation with honeybees. So this kind of idea that honeybees do all the work, I think that myth has been more or less busted, or I hope that data provides kind of a good evidence suggesting. So I'm not downplaying the importance of honeybees. I'm saying we need to kind of think more widely about how we manage pollinators. Okay, does our supply meet our demand? So this is what I've kind of been angling towards. This is kind of the business end of it. What we can do, we can model the availability of honeybees in the UK. I'm sorry, this is probably not very clear at the back, but that's just a map of the UK. We know where honeybees are, so we can map their availability. We can use biodiversity national data sets to map where pollinators are. We know where crops are. This is a case of where field beans are in the UK. So we can actually do some pretty neat kind of GIS modelling, landscape modelling, to come up with some ideas of whether supply and demand are meeting each other. And this is just illustrative. I'll just run through one example to show you what we found. So the supply of wild bees. So we know from our field work what are the main pollinators of field bean in this case. So it's a bunch of bumblebees. And we know where those bumblebees are typically found. So what we can do, we can produce a map of availability for pollination services using something called habitat suitability modelling, which is just basically a way of taking existing landscape data and being able to predict where you're going to find a particular organism. And this is a well-established, and I won't go into any details of this, but it's a well-established and validated model that lets you say, if your organisms are here and your target crop is here, what's the probability that those organisms can travel to be able to pollinate? So the details aren't important, but it is a validated set of equations underneath that. And then what we can do, we can take our different pollinators, so different bumblebees and other things. We can take our known area of field beans, and we can put all that together and sort of then ask the question, are we likely to have enough wild pollinators for the beans that we know are being grown in particular areas? We can do exactly the same thing for honeybees. So we know nationally where every, or the postcode of every honeybee hive. We know the average size of honeybee colonies. We know how far they can travel into the landscape. So again, we can draw a similar thing. We can calculate, we can estimate the availability of honeybees across the UK. So that's just very much skimming over the technical detail. So what does it mean? This is the important bit. Two maps here. Map of the UK, and this is the services provided to field bean, or potentially provided to field bean, by wild pollinators. Red is bad, yellow is okay, green is good in terms of having a good availability. And for honeybees the same, red not so good, yellow intermediate, and green good. So what we quickly do, we can identify high-risk areas. So these are areas where field beans are grown, but actually the wild pollinators and the honeybees may not be up to the job to provide enough pollination and enough stability in pollination services. But there are other areas with lower risk that basically says supply is outstripping or at least potentially meeting demand. This is kind of quite useful because you can start to plan a little bit about what crops you might want to grow depending on what availability of pollinators you have. And we can apply the same method to kind of cast forward into the future and start asking questions about how do we plan for different crops under climate change. So this is a distribution map of currant orchards in the UK. We can model that under climate change, basically a sort of a kind of a north-west shift. And we can also model our pollinators, 2050, where we expect them to be. These are apple pollinators. And if we put that together, now it hasn't come out, but this is the outline of Scotland and northern England around here. And again, there are some areas of disconnect where we could grow orchards because the climate would be right, the soil would be right, the water availability would be right, but you ain't going to have the pollinators. So that would not be a good long-term strategy. And considering it takes a long time to go from a bare piece of land up to an orchard, that would be an area to avoid. But there are some areas, again the colours haven't come out particularly well, where you do have overlap. You have the right conditions to put in an orchard, but you also have the right pollinators potentially available in the future. So again, it's a planning tool. There's lots of caveats, lots of assumptions, but it starts to give us a tool to sort of look to the future and say, well, can we think about where we want to grow new crops given things are going to change quite drastically? Question 4, how does the landscape, the wider landscape affect pollination? I'll go for this one, I might skip the next one. It's about 45 minutes. Yeah, that clock's wrong, of course.
It's 5 minutes past.
Okay. So in 2007, a bunch of pollination biologists, we got together in the States to try and ask the question. So there were a few individual studies showing that landscapes seem to have an effect on pollinators on your farm, but was there a general pattern? So what we did, we tried to answer the question, do native habitats, so that's things like woodlands or meadows or kind of fragments of high quality grassland, do they affect pollinator diversity on your crops, and do they affect the kind of visitation rates? And what we did, we pulled together a number of global data sets, and we looked at some what we call decay curves. And this is an example from coffee in Costa Rica. Basically, this is a distance away from a fragment of forest, or it could be a semi-natural grassland or something like that. And this is the visitation rate you're getting on your crop. And as you find, when you're very close to a forest fragment, you have high visitation rate on coffee, and that kind of like decays away almost to zero as you move away. So your pollinators are spilling out of the forest, going onto your coffee plantation. If we do this for all the different crops here, we can then put them into a general model and come up with a kind of overall effect of distance. So this is across many, many different crops. And we find the basic thing is that when you get to about 3/4 of a kilometre away from your forest fragment or your grassland, you've lost about half of your visits to your crop. So it's kind of a 750 metre effect. You've lost half of your bees if you move any further out. And with diversity, well, if you move to about 1.5 kilometres away from the fragment, you've lost about half of your diversity. So there's a sort of a spillover effect, but it gets less and less the further away you get. So that's one thing. That's about getting enough pollinators onto your crop to do the job. But also growers are very interested in stability. So have I got enough pollinators now? Okay, that's good. But how does that vary year on year, or how does that vary between the different fields I have on my farm? Because if you're a grower, you want to have stability, you want to have predictability, you want to know that things aren't going to vary too much, because then you can plan, you can have guaranteed incomes, you know how much inputs you need to put into your system. So we took the same studies and added a few in, and this is just an illustrative example of grapefruits farm in Argentina. You've got a nice bit of forest here, and then your pollinators are spilling out into your grapefruit fields. And with this and 28 other studies, we looked for a general pattern, and we found when you're close to your fragment, you've got high visitation rates, and that trails off as you move away, which is the same as the previous study. But in terms of stability, we find that when we've got data from multiple years or different times through the season, the variability around that mean, so the variance in the system, is much lower when you're close to the forest. So you've got more predictable, less variable pollination when you've got a big piece of natural habitat near you. And also spatially, the variation is much lower here than it is when you're a long way from the forest. So you're getting better pollination and more stable pollination if you can put your crops near kind of bits of semi-natural habitat. So you can use the natural environment to help you if you have that option. Okay, in some places we have no fragments left, but there are other options we can use instead to manage pollinators. Okay, that's the landscape. What if we then sort of focus in and think about kind of within field management or within farm management? How does that affect our pollinators? Well, around the world, how diverse are our farming systems? They're extraordinarily diverse. Big plains farming in North America, terracing in Southeast Asia, very intensive, smallholder plots in parts of Africa, low intensive farming in Eastern Europe. Super diverse, but are there any kind of general messages we can pull out from the number of studies that are conducted in all these different types of kind of farming systems? What we did, we took all these different studies and we put them together and we tried to classify farms into very simple kind of categories. A farm could be classed as conventional if it had typical high pesticides, high herbicide and high fertilizer inputs. And we class them as organic, although that's probably better termed as low input farming, but we use the label organic here, when they had zero or very low anthropogenic inputs. And we also characterize farms in terms of their overall management. So we assigned a farm as being diverse if it had small fields, if it had lots of boundary features, if it had multiple crops. So it's all about kind of local diversity. And we classified it as simple if it was a big field, monocultures, and no kind of boundary features. And if we look for some general patterns, this horrible sounding index here, this Lonsdorf landscape index, ignore that. Basically, these are nice landscapes full of lots of natural features. These are landscapes where you've basically got farming and no forest, no meadows, no nothing. So just think about this as the kind of quality of habitat increasing as you move in this direction. And this axis here is the kind of the abundance of bee pollinators on your crop. So what we find, if we look at our organic farms and the diverse ones, the ones with small fields that are complex, we find as the more habitat you have around the farm, your higher your visitation rate. That's pretty good. That's consistent with what we found previously. If we look at the other farming types, if we just take this open green circle here, and this is organic simple, so it's an organic farm still, but if it's simple, it's got bigger fields, it's not got so many boundary features, what you find is in these complex landscapes, or you get half the visitation rate just because you've gone from small fields to big fields. And if you look at your conventional farms, they're even lower still, and your most intensive conventional farms, you're getting a quarter of the visitation rate compared to an organic diverse farm. Now, there's big effects when you've got landscapes with semi-natural features in. It's more or less similar when you're talking very sterile landscapes. So there are effects of kind of farm management coming up pretty strongly there. And yeah, we get the same response for diversity of pollinators as well. So organic's better than conventional for getting pollinators on your crop. Diverse systems are better than simple. Okay, last question. So we've got declines, we've got clear value we can get from our pollinators, we've got some clear signals from the landscape, we've got some clear signals from farming that we can do things to alter pollinator communities. So what's in the toolbox? How can we get what we want out of pollinators? How can we kind of safeguard the services, considering that things are dynamic, the environment's changing, and so on? So there's a whole, I call them a toolbox of mitigation options, but it's different either policy or management options we have. If you have a crop pollination deficit or you have a need to get more pollinators onto your crop, well, you can do several things. The obvious one, you can change crops. Go from something that requires pollinators to something that doesn't. That's okay, you could do that, but many of the crops that are insect pollinated are really high value ones, fruits, coffee, things like that. So that's quite often not an option for an individual farmer. What we can do, we can add honeybees. Now, honeybees can be important but aren't always important, but honeybees have some big pluses on their side. They can be a quick fix solution. You have a problem in your orchard or your field, you can quite quickly bring in honeybee hives to try and put more pollination into the system. There is, you can get local supplies, but it's not an infinite capacity. As you see around Europe, we don't have enough honeybees to do the full work. But they are one tool in the box. They're not always the best pollinator of a crop, and they can also be expensive. So, you know, hiring of hives can be quite a big input cost. There are other managed pollinators, so there's a bumblebee industry, there's a mason bee industry. It's kind of quite small scale compared to honeybees. They can be quite effective, they are easily managed, but it's, as I said, it's not widely available for all crops. And then we've got this kind of third option about wild pollinators. So you can manage habitat to try and get pollinators in and around your farm to do the work. It's a longer term solution, so it takes some investment, but it can be a more kind of sustainable way of doing it. You can guarantee year on year you're going to get some benefits. And also putting in kind of good quality habitat for pollinators can help things like natural enemies. It can also help with soil fertility and some other things as well. So I'd just like to explore one tool before I draw some conclusions, and that's agri-environment schemes. Basically where farmers get paid for providing some sort of environmental service. And it includes things like flower strips. They're well known from individual studies that they kind of help support pollinators locally. But some pretty big questions here. So UK is going to spend £2.2 billion on Pillar 2 of CAP, which includes agri-environment schemes. That's an epic amount of money. But we've got some questions that are really unanswered. This money that's going to agri-environment schemes, how well do they work? It's kind of not until quite recently we've actually had a really good handle on that. We've put all this money into it, but are we actually getting something back, or are growers and wider public getting something back? So just thinking about pollinators, obviously agri-environment schemes are for lots of different things, but which options actually work and where should we put them? Should we just randomly throw them into the landscape, or should we be really smart and target them? And we've got some nice evidence here. So if you think about arable systems, again, what we've done, we've taken a huge number of individual studies and tried to draw out a general pattern. And we asked the question, do sown flower strips work? Does organic farming work? Does grass or naturally regenerating field corners and boundaries, does that work? And this is an effect size. So basically anything above this line saying it does work. It does help support bee diversity and abundance on your crops. And you know, these are the number of individual studies. Well, that's pretty good news. So all of them are positive and significant. So in arable systems, all of these work. That's pretty good news. So the question is, what about our kind of grassland systems, our pasture systems? So a different set of options available. Again, you can have flower strips in pasture systems, extensive grassland, basically where you take the inputs right down in meadows, or organic farming. Well, in this case, two of these things work really well. But actually, organic farming has no statistically beneficial impact on pollinators in pasture systems. Organic farming helps with a whole bunch of other things in pasture land, but for pollinators per se, it's not going to deliver. And then there's the question of where should we put these things. So we can think about landscapes can have very different forms. So this is a little cartoon of what we call a cleared landscape. It has fields. It has fields, that's it. Maybe a few buildings and some tracks. We can think about what we would call a simple landscape, where you've got things like a few hedgerows, a few small patches of natural vegetation, and then something we'd call a complex landscape, you know, nice rolling landscape, woodlots, small woodlands, bits of meadow and so on. And what we did, we asked the question, if we took the things on the previous slide we know that work, do they work equally as well in all these three sorts of landscapes? Because the UK and Europe, the world, is composed of all these kinds of landscapes. So what we did, again, we looked over a number of studies. We find in our cleared landscapes, that's where you've only got fields. Now, this is not significantly different from no effect. It's basically saying, if you put in field margins into cleared landscapes, you get no benefits. Reason being, well, we've degraded the landscape so much, we have no pollinators left. So even if you put in a glorious piece of habitat for bees, there's no bees there to take advantage of them, certainly not in the short term. If we look at our cleared landscapes, we get a very big, significant positive benefit, and that's because there are enough bees around to come in and make use of those field margins. And in complex landscapes, we also get a benefit. But the complex landscapes are already full of really nice kind of bee habitat anyway. So if you're a bee, you might go, well, I might go and see this field margin, but I might stay where I am. So there's not such a big pull, but there's still an advantage. So the key thing here is to say, actually, we want to target where we put these interventions. It's a waste of time putting them in these landscapes. It sounds sad, but we should almost sacrifice them. We've gone too far, we've degraded them so far, we can't really rescue them in the short term. But we can do a lot for these other landscapes. Okay, I think I've run over a little bit, but some brief conclusions. Pollination supply is very dynamic. It's going to be dynamic. There's lots of things changing in the environment, both on the grower side and on the environment side. So everything's in a kind of sense of flux. Wild pollinators are the unsung heroes. They do most of the work. Honeybees are important, but they're not the most important. And we certainly don't have enough honeybees to go around. So we need to think beyond honeybees to solve our kind of crop pollination questions. We have things we can do in the landscape and on the farm that definitely affect pollinators and pollination services, but we need to pick the right things and we need to put them in the right place if we're going to get the most out of our pollinator communities in terms of getting on crops and contributing to the bottom line for growers. Everything I presented is work, not just for myself, obviously from my group, and a number of projects funded by these research councils, European Union and so on. And we've got some websites that kind of have most of the details of these kind of studies here. So thank you for your time. I didn't have to use the football. I'm sorry I ran over a little bit, but thank you very much.